Well, what's up, junior high life groups? Quay here. I'm excited to be with you in your life groups, virtually on Zoom tonight, because we are finishing up our series on faith. That's right. This month we've been looking at faith. What is it? Who do we have faith in? Examples of faith. And tonight our topic, as we close up, is going to be this. The main point is this: true faith always produces action. That's right. True faith always produces action. There's a follow through to what you say. That's true faith. So before we dive in too much, I'll let you know tonight's format is a little bit different. I'm going to talk just for a short bit. I have an awesome example of this concept in action, but then I'm going to send it back to you all in your life groups with a little Bible study. Your life group leaders are going to lead you through that, and your life group's going to discuss together and see what we can learn about this idea that true faith always produces action. So that's what's going to happen, and we're just going to jump in. Like I said, if you have a Bible or a notebook or a pen, write this down. This is the main point, the big takeaway. True faith always produces action. James is going to talk about this by saying faith without works is dead. It's not real faith. In other words, if you have faith and if you believe in something and you really, truly have faith, there's going to be follow through. It's going to affect everything you do, or else it's not true faith. So one really great example of this that we saw last week, actually, when Amanda was teaching out of Hebrews 11, one example the author talks about there is Abraham. And I'm going to take his lead, and we're going to talk about Abraham as an example of true faith leading to action every single time. And so we got Abraham. Abraham's this guy, a couple generations back from Adam and Eve. And he's just, living his life, doing his thing. And one day God comes to him. The Lord comes to him and says, Abraham, I want you to set off to a new land, take your wife, and leave everything else behind that was familiar to you. Abraham's about 75 at this point, and God promises to make Abraham a great nation and to bless him and to be their God. That's what God promises. And so Abraham obeys. Abraham believes God, puts faith in him, and that faith leads to the action of Abraham obeying. And through the course of the next couple of chapters there, and as Abraham is walking in obedience, we see God promises, one, like I said, to make him a great nation and to bless him, to be their God, promises to give him land, a place for their nation to call home, promises to give him a son, promises to make his offspring as many as the stars in the sky. Think about that. As many as the stars in the sky. God promises Abraham that through Abraham, God's going to bless all nations. That's a big, big promise. So what does Abraham do as he's receiving these promises from the Lord? He obeys, right? He believes God, and his faith leads to action and obedience. So he takes his wife, he leaves his home, he leaves where he settled down, goes out into the wilderness. He becomes a nomad, basically traveling from place to place, following where God calls him to go. And real quick, if Abraham didn't obey, if Abraham didn't do what God said, what would that say about his faith? Right? If Abraham said, I believe you, God, but I'm not going to do what you say, it really doesn't speak highly of his faith. It wouldn't be true faith on Abraham's part. So as time passes, right, Abraham and Sarah, his wife, are still traveling, waiting for God to fulfill his promises in obedience. Abraham's about 100 years old at this point. That's really old, and he still doesn't have a son. Right? And God promises, right, his promises are to make a nation out of him, to give him offspring as numerous as the stars. You need a son to do that. If you don't have any sons, or you don't have any children, actually, if you don't have any children, your lineage, you have no offspring. So he needs a son. He's 100 years old, though. There's no way normally that he and Sarah would be able to have children being this old. Right? But Abraham still believes God because God promised that Abraham would have a son, and that through Abraham, God would create a great nation. So Abraham still believes God. His faith produces the action of staying the course, continuing to obey God, and trust that he would provide a son for Abraham. And you know what? He does. Sarah becomes pregnant and bears a son named Isaac. This is God's promise is fulfilled here. God gives Isaac to Abraham and Sarah as his son, as a fulfillment of the promise. And I'm sure Abraham's, celebrating, God, you were so good. This is the answer, right? You provided a son when there's no way we should have normally been able to have a son. Right? And so all things look good, but then God says this. He tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, to bring him up on the mountain, to put him on an altar, to sacrifice him to the Lord. Kind of confusing if God's promised to give you offspring and make a nation out of you, and the way he's doing that is through your son, and now he's saying to sacrifice that son? Doesn't make sense, right? But Abraham believed God. And so he goes to do it. He obeys. And right in the last moment, right before he sacrifices his son, God provides a ram. An angel comes down and says, no, there's a ram right here as a substitute for that sacrifice, which, by the way, is a great illustration for what Christ does on the cross for us in taking our place, deserving of punishment. But back to Abraham. Abraham obeys, even when God says something that sounds counterintuitive to what God is promising. But Abraham obeys. By faith, Abraham went out into the wilderness when God told him to. By faith, Abraham has a son. By faith, Abraham obeyed and offered his son to God as a sacrifice. Abraham's faith, being true, produced action in him time and time again. Right? To sum it up, Abraham followed through. Abraham put his money where his mouth was. Abraham followed through in his actions with what he believed. True faith in Abraham produced action. Right? And so as we close up, I hope that's a good example of Abraham's life. Of Abraham who believed God and obeyed because of his actions came as a fruit, came as a product of his faith. So we're going to read as we close up Genesis 15, 5-6. It says this about Abraham, talking about God and Abraham. And he brought him outside and said, so this is God bringing Abraham outside. And he brought him outside and said, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. There's one of those promises we were talking about. And he says, verse 6, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So as we look at that story, we have to remember and know that it's not Abraham's actions that justified him before God. It's not all the things he did, but it's that he believed God. And he was counted as righteous. God counted him as righteous because of his belief. And we know about that belief because of the actions, because of the follow-through, because of the fruit that it produced. But it wasn't the actions that saved him. So you gotta kind of keep those two in both hands, right? Remember both those at the same time. True faith always produces action, yes. But it's the faith in God, faith for us, faith in Jesus specifically, that saves us, not those actions. It's the faith that leads to the actions, right? Ephesians 2:8 says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not the works of man, so that none may boast. So it's by grace we're saved because of the faith that we have, right? And it's not works. But true faith always has action with it. And that's the key. That's how you know it's true faith. So as we wrap up, you guys in your life groups are going to take a look at James chapter 2, 14-26. It's a great passage, and James is going to talk a lot about faith and works and what they mean together. So as you do that, I want to give you one little hint, because there's something kind of confusing in James chapter 2, verse 24. It says this, a person is justified by works. Right here, a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. person is justified by works and not by faith alone. So I want you to wrestle with this, with what James is saying. How can that be true? Is this a contradiction? Talk to your leaders about this, but I'll give you this one piece of kind of help, one way to enter in. That is this. The faith James is referring to here is quote unquote faith that doesn't produce actions. Right? It's faith without actions. In other words, it's bogus faith. It's not true faith. It's not works that can save us, but faith that doesn't produce works is no faith at all. Let me say that again. It's not the works that save us, but faith that doesn't produce works, faith that isn't followed by action, faith that isn't followed through with obedience is no faith at all. And so that's how we can take what James is saying and take what Paul is saying in Ephesians and take what we see here in Genesis and have it all make sense. And hopefully it spurs us on to think about our own faith. Does my faith produce action? And if not, where am I being called to obey? Where am I being called to follow up, to follow through? So guys, discuss this in your life groups tonight. It's going to be a good time. So grab your Bibles, grab your life. I'm going to say bye here. I love you guys. Can't wait to be with you guys in person. Looking forward to it. It's coming soon. So yeah, have a great night with your life groups. I'll see you later, and I'm signing off.